Kyoto, 794 AD. The Emperor of Japan moves his court to a new capital, a city of extraordinary elegance, laid out on a grid modeled on the Tang Dynasty capital of Chang'an, filled with palaces and temples and the refined bureaucratic apparatus of a civilization that has been importing Chinese administrative culture for 2 centuries. The city is called Heian-kyo. It will give its name to an entire era, and it is, in the most precise sense, the place where the samurai are born, not on a battlefield, not in a warrior tradition, but in the accounting books of a government that is about to make a fiscal decision it cannot undo. The decision seems sensible at the time. It almost always does. The imperial court is expensive to run. The conscript army that the Ritsuryo legal codes mandate, a force of provincial soldiers raised by tax, trained at state expense, and maintained in rotating service, is more expensive still. The soldiers are not particularly effective. The peasants conscripted into service are farmers, not fighters. They resent the obligation. They desert when they can. They require feeding, equipping, and administering across a country whose geography makes centralized military logistics a permanent nightmare. The return on this investment is poor, so the court does what governments do when a program is expensive and underperforming. It cuts it. The conscript army is abolished. Provincial security will be handled locally. The aristocratic clans that govern the provinces will manage their own affairs. The court will focus on what it does well: poetry, ceremony, calligraphy, the exquisite refinement of a culture that considers itself the most sophisticated on earth. What the court does not consider is what happens when the aristocratic clans decide that managing their own affairs includes managing each other with weapons. The Heian period is, by the standards of its own values, a genuine achievement. The court at Kyoto produces a literary and artistic culture of extraordinary sophistication. Lady Murasaki Shikibu writes The Tale of Genji in the early 11th century, widely considered the world's first novel, a work of psychological depth and narrative complexity that European literature will not approach for another 6 centuries. Court poetry reaches refinements of form and feeling that require years of dedicated study to fully appreciate. Architecture, garden design, musical performance, the art of dress all reach standards of elaboration that define Japanese aesthetic culture to the present day. But the court is not governing Japan in any meaningful sense. It is performing governance. The elaborate bureaucratic structure imported from China, the ministries, the ranks, the titles, the procedures, operates as ceremonial machinery. Real decisions about land, taxation, and violence are happening elsewhere. In the provinces, where the court's writ is increasingly theoretical, the land system is the mechanism of the court's self-destruction. The Ritsuryo codes had specified that all land in Japan belongs to the emperor. Farmers work it in exchange for tax payments that flow to the central government. This system functions tolerably in the early Nara period when the central administration is genuinely capable of enforcing it. It begins to break down almost immediately as powerful families find ways around it. The mechanism is called shoen, tax-exempt private estates. Wealthy Buddhist temples and powerful aristocratic families develop the practice of receiving land donations from smaller farmers who are struggling under the tax burden, then registering that land as exempt from imperial taxation. The farmer becomes a tenant on land that now belongs to the temple or the noble family, paying a reduced rent instead of a state tax, but immune to the obligations that the state can impose. The arrangement suits everyone except the imperial treasury. The farmer pays less, the noble or temple collects the rent, and the central government loses revenue. The shoen system spreads through the 8th and 9th centuries, with the momentum of any arrangement that benefits the parties directly involved at the expense of a distant abstraction. By the 10th century, significant portions of Japan's agricultural land have been removed from the imperial tax base. The court's revenues are shrinking. Its ability to fund any kind of military force, even if it wanted to, is disappearing along with the tax base that would pay for it. Outside the capital, Japan in the 9th and 10th centuries is a landscape of expanding agricultural frontier, land disputes, and violence that the court either cannot see from Kyoto or chooses not to. New land is being brought under cultivation in the provinces. The families that do this work, clearing forest, building irrigation systems, establishing farming communities, are not going to surrender what they have built to a distant tax collector whose enforcement capacity is declining every decade. These provincial families are not peasants. They are the lower branches of aristocratic clans, men who have been sent to the provinces as administrators and have stayed, marrying into local families, building local power bases, accumulating the land and followers that the capital's cramped hierarchy of court rank cannot provide. They are literate, they are organized, and they are increasingly armed. They have to be. The countryside is not peaceful. Bandits operate on the roads. Rival families dispute land boundaries. The provincial governors appointed by the court are temporary officials who arrive, collect what they can, and leave. They have neither the interest nor the capacity to provide genuine security. The families that provide genuine security, that organize the local defense of farming communities, suppress bandits, and enforce the land arrangements that keep the agricultural economy functioning, accumulate something more valuable than land. They accumulate loyalty. Men follow them not because the court has appointed them, but because they can protect what matters. These men begin to specialize. Not every member of a provincial family needs to be a warrior, but the families that maintain a corps of trained mounted fighting men, men who can respond quickly to raids, enforce boundaries, and project force across a district, have a decisive advantage over those that do not. The mounted warrior becomes a professional role, distinct from the farmer and the administrator, trained from childhood in the specific skills that mounted combat requires. The word that attaches to these men is bushi. The class they form is the warrior class. The code and culture that eventually develops around them will be called bushido. But in the 9th and 10th centuries, none of these frameworks yet exist. What exists is simply a practical arrangement. Provincial families need armed men need patrons, and the imperial court, which has abolished its army and watched its revenues decline, has no mechanism for providing either. Two families rise above the others to define what the warrior class becomes. Their names will echo through 1,000 years of Japanese history. The Taira and the Minamoto, rival clans, both descended from imperial princes sent to the provinces when the court needed to reduce the number of princes drawing imperial stipends, both building warrior networks across the country, both accumulating the military capacity and provincial alliances that will eventually make them the real powers in Japan. The descent from imperial lineage matters. It gives the warrior clans a legitimacy that pure provincial origin could not provide. They are not simply armed men who have seized power. They are the emperor's relatives, performing the military function that the court acknowledges it cannot perform itself. This fiction, that the warrior clans serve the imperial court rather than replacing it, will be maintained for centuries with increasing strain, because it suits both parties. The court retains its ceremonial dignity. The warrior clans receive the official appointments that legitimate their authority. The arrangement is mutual hypocrisy that functions as political stability. The court's relationship with the warrior clans is already visible in the title that the great commanders will eventually hold. Sei Tai Shogun, Generalissimo for the suppression of barbarians. The title is borrowed from the military campaigns against the Emishi people of northern Japan, the indigenous inhabitants whom the imperial state has been fighting to displace and subdue since the 8th century. Those campaigns are the crucible in which the mounted warrior tradition is developed. The Emishi fight as mounted archers on the rough terrain of northern Honshu, a style of warfare that requires a specific response. The imperial forces learn to fight them by becoming like them. Mounted, fast, expert with the bow from horseback. The Minamoto and Taira clans build their reputations in these northern campaigns. The warrior skills they develop there, horsemanship, archery, sword work, the tactical reading of difficult terrain, become the defining accomplishments of the Bushi class. A man who can ride at full gallop and put an arrow through a target at 50 meters is performing a skill that takes a lifetime to develop. He is not a conscripted farmer. He is a specialist whose entire identity is organized around martial capacity. The 10th century brings the moment when the court stops pretending it can manage without the warriors entirely. The Fujiwara clan, the great court aristocrats who dominate the high-end government through a system of marrying their daughters to emperors and ruling as regents for the child emperors who result, have their own military problem. The court needs warriors to suppress bandits on the capital roads, guard palace precincts, and handle the occasional outbreak of violence that even refined Kyoto cannot entirely avoid. The Fujiwara employ bushi from the Taira and Minamoto clans as palace guards and enforcers. The warriors come to the capital, see its wealth and its structural helplessness, and draw their own conclusions. The conclusions are not yet acted upon. The cultural gap between the court aristocracy and the provincial warriors is vast enough in the 10th and early 11th centuries that direct challenge to court authority is not yet imaginable. The courtiers regard the warriors with a mixture of contempt and dependency, necessary men, useful men, but rough men, unsuited to the true refinements of civilization. The warriors regard the courtiers with a mixture of awe and calculation that, over generations, tilts increasingly toward calculation. The Hogan Rebellion of 1156 is the moment the calculation becomes explicit. A succession dispute within the imperial family produces two rival claimants, each backed by a faction of court nobles. Both factions hire warrior clans to fight their battles. The Minamoto and Taira find themselves on opposite sides of a civil conflict that the court has produced but cannot resolve without them. Swords are drawn in the streets of Kyoto, a thing that the high-end ideal of refined civilization has managed to avoid for centuries. The warriors win the battle. More importantly, they win the understanding. The court cannot function without them. Its legitimacy is real. The emperor's ritual authority is genuine and will remain genuine for another 7 centuries. But legitimacy without force is ceremony. And force, in Japan of the 12th century, belongs entirely to the warriors. 1159 AD Kyoto. The Heiji Rebellion is a palace coup. A faction of Minamoto warriors, allied with dissatisfied court nobles, seizes the retired emperor and takes control of the palace while Taira, no Kiyomori, the dominant military figure of the era, is away on a pilgrimage. Kiyomori returns immediately. He crushes the coup with a speed and decisiveness that demonstrates exactly where real power now resides. The aftermath is significant. The Minamoto leadership is destroyed. Minamoto no Yoshitomo, the clan chief, is killed. His sons, including a young boy named Yoritomo, are spared on the advice of Kiyomori's stepmother, who was moved to mercy by the children's youth. It is a decision that will define the next generation of Japanese history. Kiyomori sends Yoritomo into exile in the Izu Peninsula. Watched but alive, a potential future problem that the present moment does not seem urgent enough to eliminate. Kiyomori does what no warrior before him has attempted. He does not remain a military servant of the court. He moves into the court. He takes court ranks and titles, marries his daughters into the imperial family, and positions the Taira clan as the dominant political force in Kyoto through exactly the methods the Fujiwara had used for centuries: dynastic marriage and administrative occupation of key positions. He has a grandson on the imperial throne by 1180. The warrior has become the ruler, dressed in aristocratic robes, speaking the language of court culture, maintaining the fiction that the emperor governs while ensuring that the Taira clan holds every real lever of power. The court aristocrats despise him. The rival warriors resent him. His overreach, the visible, unapologetic transformation of warrior power into court dominance, alienates the very clans whose cooperation his position requires. The Minamoto, scattered but not destroyed, begin to organize. The young man in exile on the Izu Peninsula, now 33 years old, begins to receive visitors. 1180 AD, the Izu Peninsula. Minamoto no Yoritomo receives a call to arms from a member of the imperial family who has been passed over in the Taira-managed succession. The letter circulates to warrior clans across the eastern provinces, the Kanto region, far from Kyoto's direct control, where Minamoto influence runs deep and Taira authority is resented as distant imposition. The response surprises even Yoritomo. Clan after clan declares for the Minamoto. Men who have been waiting for exactly this moment, a legitimate leader with imperial blood backing and genuine warrior credentials, emerge from across the eastern provinces with their retinues and their horses and their decades of accumulated grievance against Taira dominance. The Genpei War that follows, 5 years of fighting between the Taira and Minamoto clans across the length of Japan, is the war that burns the samurai tradition into the Japanese cultural memory. Its battles, its heroes, its tragedies are the subject of the Heike Monogatari, the tale of the Heike, the great epic of medieval Japan, recited by blind monks at roadside shrines for centuries, the Japanese equivalent of the Iliad. The war produces the aesthetic of the samurai, the lone warrior's death poem, the single combat between champions announced with the formal recitation of lineage, the concept of a beautiful death in battle as the highest expression of a warrior life. But underneath the aesthetics, the war is a political and economic conflict about who controls Japan's land and its revenues. The Taira have centralized too much, antagonized too many provincial clans, and made the cardinal error of confusing court culture with real power. When the test comes, their army in the east is thin, and their provincial alliances are unreliable. Yoritomo never goes to the front himself. He stays in Kamakura, building the administrative machinery of a new kind of government while his cousin Yoshinaka and his brothers Noriori and Yoshitsune fight the actual battles. The Taira are destroyed at the naval battle of Dan no Ura in 1185. The child emperor Antoku, Kiyomori's grandson, the embodiment of everything the Taira had built, drowns in the inland sea when his grandmother jumps into the water with him rather than surrender to the Minamoto forces. The imperial regalia go into the sea with them. The Taira clan is finished. Kamakura, 1185. Yoritomo does not go to Kyoto. He stays in Kamakura, a town on the eastern coast, far from the capital, surrounded by hills on three sides and the sea on the fourth, a natural defensive position that puts geography between him and the court he has just made irrelevant. He builds a government there, not a court government, a warrior government, the Bakufu, the tent government, the military administration that will rule Japan for 7 centuries through 3 successive warrior dynasties. The innovation is institutional. Yoritomo creates a system for managing the warrior clans that does not depend on the court's authority and does not require the court's participation. He appoints shugo, military governors, to each province, responsible for maintaining order and commanding local warriors. He appoints jito, land stewards, to manage the shoen estates, collecting revenues and enforcing the warrior clan's authority at the local level. These positions are held by warriors, accountable to Kamakura, independent of the Kyoto court hierarchy. In 1192, the emperor grants Yoritomo the title of Sei-tai Shogun, the old title from the Emishi campaigns. Now repurposed as the formal designation of the warrior government's supreme commander, the emperor retains his ritual authority. The shogun holds actual power. The arrangement that will define Japanese governance for the next 7 centuries is in place. The court in Kyoto continues. The emperor continues. The poetry and the ceremony and the calligraphy continue. But the government of Japan has moved to a wooden military compound on the eastern coast, run by men in armor who settled disputes with swords and measured loyalty in land grants rather than court ranks. The samurai are not the product of a martial culture that was always there waiting to emerge. They are the product of a specific sequence of institutional failures, an army abolished to save money, a tax system undermined by the shoen exemptions, a court that confused aesthetic refinement with political capacity, and a countryside full of armed men whose skills the government needed, but whose ambitions it could not control. Every step of the process is comprehensible in isolation. The conscript army is genuinely expensive and genuinely ineffective. The shoen system genuinely benefits the people directly involved in each transaction. The court genuinely cannot administer a country as geographically complex as Japan from a single capital with declining revenues. The provincial families genuinely need security that nobody else is providing. Each decision, each arrangement, each accommodation makes sense in the moment it is made. The accumulation is the catastrophe. Or rather, the accumulation is the origin. Because what emerges from these compounded failures is not simply a political problem. It is a warrior tradition of extraordinary depth and durability. A class of professional fighters whose identity, ethics, and aesthetic are entirely organized around martial excellence, whose loyalty to their lord is the defining social bond of medieval Japanese life, and whose influence on Japanese culture reaches forward to the present day in forms that are instantly recognizable across the world. The emperor whose court makes the original fiscal decision in 794, abolishing the conscript army, betting that the provinces can manage themselves, is not thinking about what Japan will look like in 400 years. He is thinking about this year's budget. The accountants who calculate that the conscript system costs more than it produces are solving a real problem with reasonable arithmetic. The aristocrats who accept shoen donations from struggling farmers are making sensible local arrangements. None of them are creating the samurai. The samurai create themselves in the space these decisions open with the tools these failures provide. The empty treasury does not build a warrior class, it simply stops being able to prevent one.